I am just getting started on some research about the economic side of prenatal testing and disability selective abortion. So most of you probably know that's just the abortion that happens after parents receive a positive prenatal diagnosis of some disability in utero. And as you probably know, it's fairly high. For example, the best figures we have are for those children with Down syndrome. It ranges somewhere maybe between roughly 70 and 90% is the abortion rate for children who receive a diagnosis of Down syndrome in utero. Most disabilities track those numbers as well, but we don't have great data in this country on reasons for abortions. So anyway, I am going to talk mostly first about what led me to this project, why it's important. Then I'm going to lay out some of the parameters of the cost-effectiveness research, tell you about the sort of paradigm in the field, then talk about some things you might find interesting, and then I'll do kind of a quick critique of this kind of research in general. So let me say, and I'm going to take a little bit to set this up because the context is so important for this in terms of understanding why this is important, why this question of cost effectiveness is important. I started working in the area of disability selective abortion about 10 years ago, actually maybe closer to 12, sort of coincident with my own the birth of my son, Tommy, who has Down syndrome. I started getting interested in this question. And when I started out, I would have told you that I was pretty sure about two things. I would have said, first of all, that we would have very limited chance of banning these kind of abortions outright, right? That there wasn't going to be much hope for sort of legislative action in this area. The second thing I was really sure of was that eugenics-based arguments against disability selective abortion would have no traction, right? It wasn't that we didn't realize that these abortions had eugenic overtones or were eugenic. It was just simply that there seemed to be reticence in academic context, in legislative work, even in the church, to sort of talk openly about the idea of eugenics. And therein was the problem. What accounted for people's reluctance to bring up eugenics is its association, right, with World War II Germany. You probably know that the American eugenics campaign strove to create a healthy society, right, by encouraging breeding among the fit. You might recall hearing, for example, of things like the Better Baby Contest, right, at state fairs. This was from the Indiana State Fair. In retrospect, these kind of things seem a little bit sort of charmingly naive compared to some of the later policies of the eugenics movement. For example, immigration bans were one of the practices of the American eugenics movement. We had also compulsory sterilization of the so-called feeble-minded. Here's a picture of Carrie Buck. She was made famous as a subject of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' opinion in Buck versus Bell, right? The Supreme Court decision legitimizing mandatory sterilization, which declared that society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit, right, from continuing their kind. At issue in the case was whether Carrie Buck could be sterilized against her will. And you might remember that Holmes became infamous for saying 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, right? He answered in the affirmative that she could be sterilized. These practices also included institutionalization of those who were feeble-minded to kind of segregate them from society and also keep them from reproducing. It's very hard to talk about eugenics in general without reference to Germany, because Germany imported these practices pretty much wholesale, right, a little bit before World War II. And of course, they made clear the full horror of eugenics when carried to its fairly logical conclusion, right? Instead of just keeping people from reproducing, actually destroying the individuals who were thought to be unfit. It's even harder to talk about disability selective abortion without mentioning this, because the first victims of the Nazi eugenics were those who were feeble in mind and body. You might know that approximately 300,000 individuals with disabilities were killed under the Nazi T4 program between 1939 and 1945. Actually, it was at Brandenburg, the first T4 site, that the methods of euthanasia were really perfected, right, for the death camps in Germany in general. The parallels, I think, are even more striking because it's estimated that over half of the victims of the T4 program were actually children. But despite the obvious similarities, there was a certain reluctance to invoke these events in the U.S. and Germany as somewhat of a cautionary tale. There's a cliche, right, that sooner or later every argument somebody brings up the Nazis, right, and that shuts this sort of argument down. But here we are, 10 years later, and it turns out I was dead wrong on both of these issues. Not only do we have disability selective abortion bans that have been passed in 5 states. Actually, North Dakota is one where it's only one where it currently is in place. The other ones have been challenged in the courts, but they still were passed. There are 5 more states that have introduced but not yet enacted disability selective abortion bans. And it turns out that actually the strongest argument in favor of these bans has been the argument that this practice is eugenic. This second development, this sort of describing these abortions as eugenic, is particularly important because the discussion about these abortions as eugenics has been taking place in the context of the judicial opinion surrounding the passing of these bans. So, for example, you might know that a panel of the Seventh Circuit heard the case of the Indiana abortion ban. It was passed and then challenged in the court. It went to the Seventh Circuit Court, and they ruled the ban was unconstitutional. The state appealed and asked for the case to be heard en banc by the whole bench. The courts denied, but Judge Frank Easterbrook delivered the dissenting opinion here, and he referred to these abortions as eugenic. Okay, so this is really important. Judge Daniel Mannion, in a concurring opinion in this case, also referred to these abortions as private eugenics, a term I'll talk about in a moment. Most importantly, the definitive endorsement, I think, for this notion that these abortions are eugenic came from the Supreme Court opinion. Indiana had appealed the Seventh Court's decision that I just talked about. They petitioned the Supreme Court to hear the case. The Supreme Court denied hearing. But it was the occasion for Justice Clarence Thomas to issue a very scathing indictment of the potential, the eugenic potential of these kind of abortions. He said, enshrining the constitutional right to an abortion based solely on the race, sex, or disability of an unborn child would constitutionalize the views of the 20th century eugenics movement. So this is huge. I mean, these opinions have really given us sort of a forum in which we can talk about eugenics openly. What exactly do we mean, right? Is this the same kind of eugenics, right, that was happening in the 30s? So, public acceptance of eugenics came to an end, right, in the 30s with the exposure, or early 40s with the exposure to the atrocities of World War II. And eventually we recognized all these practices, forced sterilization, institutionalization, immigration ban. Well, immigration bans is still up for grabs, but in general we recognize them as the grave injustices that we were. So how then, 100 years later, and this really does mark about the 100-year anniversary of Indiana, at least passing the first compulsory sterilization law, how are we 100 years later still in a position when we're doing something that appears to be, and very much so, I think, is eugenics? Certainly, we should be able to recognize this for what it is, right? What form has eugenics taken such that it's being allowed to flourish? And I think the best explanation of this is that eugenics never really went away. We'd like to think that this was an unfortunate but discrete period in our history, but eugenics practices and attitudes have really remained with us. While eugenics as a social movement in the U.S. was curtailed after the 1940s, the discriminatory practices of eugenic sterilization and institutionalization of those with disabilities really continued on for decades. Moreover, with the development of the new science of genetics, some geneticists just proposed that this new science be used for social engineering. So in the eugenics movement proper, right, you had sort of dubious science driving compulsory social policies. Now within the scientifically robust field of genetics, there were still those that proposed that these scientific advances could be used for social engineering. The continuity of purpose between these two fields, eugenics and genetics, is most clearly evidenced in the proposal for the destruction of what are so-called defective fetuses. So, for example, James Watson one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project, said that actually we place most of our hopes for genetics in identifying and terminating pregnancies, right? That he said would be a horrible blight on families' prospects for future success. The key difference here, though, even though this sort of rhetoric is very hauntingly similar to that of the eugenics movement, the key difference is that while the eugenics movement focused on sweeping social change, right, and compulsory tactics, practitioners of clinical genetics, as seen clearly, I think, in prenatal testing, emphasize sort of optional screening and individual counseling or individual genetic counseling, right? So all at an individual level. So this social engineering is going on at sort of a micro level, at least at on face value, at the level of the individual or the family. And so this focus on individual reproductive choice rather than on compulsory public policies has been termed backdoor eugenics, right? We're getting to the same place as we were, just through a different route, right? A less conspicuous sort of route, the back door. This has also been called new or liberal eugenics. Robert Sparrow summed up the work of these new eugenicists. He said, they're pluralistic based on good science, concerned with the welfare of individuals, would respect the rights of individuals, right? And distinguish them from the old eugenics, right? Which was problematic in many ways and coercive. He goes on to say that according to the advocates of the new eugenics, the horrors associated with the old eugenics should not prevent us from embracing the opportunities offered by recent advances in the biological sciences. This new eugenics has also been called private eugenics by Judge Mannion. Others have pointed out that this eugenic is very much part of our individualistic, capitalistic society. It's been called market-based eugenics, right? Children are increasingly regarded as made-to-order consumer products. And so whatever you want to call it, new eugenics, private eugenics, market-based eugenics, backdoor eugenics, the basic idea is this is kind of a bottom-up eugenics, right? This is just simply the aggregate of many individual decisions rather than top-down eugenics, right? So it's sort of the result of public policies. I believe Leon Cass has argued that the difference between private and maybe public eugenics at a certain point is unimportant, this distinction, because really the exercise of private eugenics creates social norms which function in the same way as public policy might to exert pressure on women to abort. But I'm going to argue today that we should maintain this distinction between public and private eugenics because the recent characterization of disability selective abortions as purely private is somewhat misleading. Certainly, private eugenic decisions are occurring, and I believe Cass is correct that these decisions get a certain or take on a certain normative power. However, I think we also risk missing a very important piece of this puzzle if we fail to see that the individual choices that parents are making regarding the life and death of their children with disabilities, these very private eugenic decisions, are made in the much larger context of a healthcare system, including professional organization, insurance companies, public health departments, which exhibit a very clear eugenic agenda. And this eugenic bias is evidenced not so much in policy statements, although we do see some. Here's one by Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders under I think, Bill Clinton. Abortion has had an important and positive public health effect in that it has reduced the number of children afflicted with severe defects. And actually, the children with severe defects you were talking about were children with Down syndrome. It is seen most clearly, I think, in the policies themselves, in the widespread offer of prenatal screening to all pregnant women. In 2007, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommended that every single pregnant woman be offered prenatal screening. And in the absence of any true health benefit, especially for those disabilities such as Down syndrome, currently there are very few conditions that we treat before birth, it seems implausible that we can justify upwards of probably about $1 billion spent annually in prenatal screening by public and private health insurance unless there's some tangible benefit, right? You need to try to figure out where the benefit lies. The state of California, which is the only state that actually has a state-sponsored screening program, defends its program. When it was challenged, it defended it by saying that they only provide options and choices. They're not either eugenic or coercive. But it seems very implausible. It seems more plausible that what is incentivizing the funding of widespread prenatal screening is not the promotion of options and choices for women, right? It hardly seems like they would justify spending $1 billion a year just so that women can have better choices, but the economic benefit of the abortions which follow the screening at a very high rate. This is rarely discussed overtly in the field, right? You don't often see this in policy statements, but there are hundreds of articles assessing the cost-effectiveness screening of prenatal tests in the mainstream obstetric literature. The goal then of my project is to detail the parameters of this research to further an understanding in the present debate of the extent to which what we think of as very private decisions of parents are being made in a much larger context of very public financial considerations. Very similar to those that played a role in the U.S. eugenics movement. This is Dr. Albert Priddy of the Virginia colony. He was one of the earliest proponents of compulsory sterilization laws because he argued that it would save the taxpayers money. It's also very hauntingly similar to the economic justification behind the T4 program in Germany. This was from a poster that was distributed in World War II, showing the German citizen exactly how much his fellow citizen with a disability would cost him, right? Let me lay out the paradigm and the cost-effectiveness research in prenatal screening and just sort of look at what exactly this kind of research entails. The basic premise of this research is that children with a disability represent a certain lifetime cost, right, to the whole system, to the medical system in general, but also sort of just to our sort of social system. A prenatal screen is cost-effective if the overall cost of administration, right, of the screening program is kind of recouped by detecting and aborting infants with disabilities. Let me show you this as an example. I use this. This actually comes from a study in 1991, and actually this was done in the UK. But I like it because it's just a really neat summary of a basic calculation used to get a statistic, sort of an index of how much these abortions are costing. So prices are off here, and they use pounds instead of US dollars. But the math is really simple. On the top is just a list of the various procedures that need to be used, right, for prenatal screening. So they've listed the screening technique, which was 10 pounds, and amnio, which cost £95, and then the cost of abortion and counseling, which was 950 pounds. And then all they do is they look at a couple examples. And in the first one, they're assuming 100% uptake of these procedures. And that's sort of your optimal scenario. And they just calculate out. So based on 100% uptake, how many screening tests will have to be paid for, how many amniocentesis will have to follow based on a positive screen, and then how many terminations will be done and how much that will cost. We get a total cost, and to get our index, we just divide that by the total number of abortions. So now, as I say at the top, now we've got the calculation of a cost per avoided birth of a baby with Down syndrome. So it costs, under this scenario, about £24,000 to detect each child with Down syndrome, right? So to sort of not just detect, but detect and avert each child with Down syndrome. With a little bit less optimal uptake, it's estimated that it would cost about £29,000 per child detected and avoided. So what we do with this figure, obviously, because here's a cost, right? We're going to pay this per child detected, is we need to compare it to how much this child will cost us over the course of his lifetime. So in this example, I think these researchers estimated that a cost of a child with Down syndrome would be about £90,000, okay, over the course of his lifetime. And so you just take the amounts that the child would cost, subtract the amount spent, and you get a savings here of what, like £61,000, right? So substantial cost saving per child aborted. This research, that this index is same index is used today. 20 years later, we're still using basically the same index. I think the most recent figures I've heard in the U.S. In terms of how much a child with Down syndrome costs us over his lifetime were about between $500,000 to $700,000. For most studies, cost is not the only consideration. In general, researchers want to balance the cost effectiveness against other factors, and most often they want to balance it against the rate of procedure-related miscarriages. As you know, amniocentesis has a low but still significant risk of miscarriage associated with it. So for some screening tests, which might have higher false positive rates, this would induce more parents to get an abortion or more mothers to get an abortion and would cause higher miscarriage rates. So here is what the results section from such a study that is going to sort of balance costs against miscarriage rates would look like. So you can see what they're referring to here is several different kinds of screening procedures. They said that sequential screening was the least expensive. It detected the most Down syndrome fetuses, averted the most Down syndrome live births, but dang, here it led to the highest number of procedure-related euploid losses. What's a euploid loss? The loss of a typical child, right? The integrated screen had the fewest euploid losses and averted the second most Down syndrome live births. So relatively, this one's looking pretty good. Not as many typical children were lost, and it still came in second in terms of averting Down syndrome live births. You would have to recalculate a little bit. This is based on a abortion rate of about 70%. So if the abortion rate drops below 70%, then another screening method would be most effective, most cost effective. You might notice two things here is even though researchers try to minimize the number of typical children lost, right, in these procedures, there is sort of an acceptance that some normal children must be sacrificed, right, to reach our goal of cost effectiveness, right? They're kind of these small martyrs, right, to our financial gain here. Second, there is no room here to mourn the loss of children who are not typically developing. So, for example, in this example, children with Down syndrome, in fact, the number of children with Down syndrome lost through miscarriage is not even reported. In fact, I was looking one day to see if I could find any evidence in the journals of critiques of this model as a way of assessing prenatal screening protocols. And just to let you know, there is actually somebody who is critiquing these. His name is Brian Scottco, and I'm going to talk in a minute about his work. But I could find virtually nothing else until I came across a study. You'll see why the title caught my eye. Prenatal screening for Down syndrome should focus on safety more than cost effectiveness. And I thought, oh wait, maybe here's a study that finds these studies to be relatively or somewhat problematic. But then I went on to read the body of this, and you don't have to read through the whole thing necessarily, but you can see that, okay, the most cost-effective model will result in the loss of 859 chromosomally normal fetuses, okay? They go on to compare that to another screening protocol that would result in the loss of just 62 fetuses. And he points out, and he should, that the difference in loss rates is almost 14-fold. And so he's trying to make the general point that we really should be considering safety and not cost effectiveness here. And he says he's concerned that managed care plans will focus on the cost effectiveness cited in this article, et cetera. But look at the bottom, the very last sentence. He says, in addition, the emotional loss and psychological impact of losing a very wanted and chromosomally normal pregnancy cannot be adequately calculated, right? So how can it be that there is no understanding that there are parental hearts which would be broken by the loss of a child with Down syndrome with a so-called abnormal chromosomal structure? Surely you would think that after, 50 years of disability rights legislation, after all the campaigns, the public relations campaigns put on by advocacy groups, right? After all the, cute commercials on television, people with Down syndrome, in the fall, the boys with Down syndrome that, catch the winning touchdown, and the girls who are crowned prom queen. Certainly somebody in the field of obstetrics would understand that there are parents who value these children and who would mourn their loss if they were lost in pregnancy. Another point worth making here is that besides this sort of ode to the safeguarding of our typically developing children, I found very little acknowledgement that this paradigm was problematic, ethically problematic. There was no sense of revulsion at the idea of assigning a price to the heads of infants. Instead, most researchers acknowledge that there are ethical implications of this work, but the paradigm itself is not ethically problematic. So in this paper, the authors say that some would question whether we should seek to prevent the birth of imperfect individuals. These ethical issues cannot be reduced to economic considerations. So that's all good so far. And then they go on to say, but in this paper, by examining cost effectiveness alone, we make no judgments on these issues. So there seems to be no recognition that the cost effectiveness paradigm, regardless of its impact on policy and practices, is very problematic. This last sort of ethical analysis, or this analysis of the ethical implications, can serve as a good point to talk about a little bit about the issue of whether these studies do indeed inform public policy, right, and do indeed or inform parental decision making. And I don't have an exact answer to this. It's hard to track some of the relationships between policy and practice, but I think the answer to both is going to be in the affirmative, that these studies do inform policy, that these policies do inform the choices of parents. It's generally thought in the U.S. that cost-effectiveness research is not as central to our healthcare system because it's not a socialized system of medicine, as we see in other countries with national healthcare systems. And this actually might explain, we do see, it's hard to believe that it's higher, but we do see a higher rate of abortion of children with disabilities in European countries, and it may be because it's tied to the policies there, which are in national healthcare systems. However, I can't believe that these studies are not informing the policies in our country. For example, the choice of California, right, to offer prenatal screening to all pregnant women, insurance companies covering screening, et cetera. It's hard to believe that they are not doing this because of the cost effectiveness. An article in 2010 in the most mainstream journal of obstetrics, the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, after detailing here the astronomical cost of healthcare, goes on to say that indeed economic analysis have been used for at least 30 years to inform the development of prenatal screening and diagnosis guidelines. In 2007, as I mentioned, so fairly recently, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists changed its guidelines to recommend screening for all pregnant women. And many of those in the Down syndrome particularly felt that this was an attack on infants with Down syndrome, right? That the over 35 screening policy, just screening women over 35, which had been in place, had missed too many infants with Down syndrome. And so now the field seemed to be going after all those stragglers, right? All those children of women who were under 35. Of course, the response from the ACOG, the professional organization, was that this policy, screening policy, was only meant to offer additional choice, more choice to women who were younger, who were under 35. But what's interesting, if you look at the cost effectiveness literature right before this policy came out, it was emerging with data suggesting that there were economic benefits to testing women under 35. So for example, this study here said that there was no economic evidence to support the existing guidelines that recommend offering prenatal diagnostic testing only to women 35 or older. In fact, we found no age threshold below which prenatal diagnosis would be cost ineffective. So this seems to give lie to the ACOG sort of official policy that these abortions, that this policy was not changed so that we could indeed sort of pick up or screen more children with Down syndrome. Another very recent and disturbing bit of research in this area that's coming out of the cost effectiveness literature is actually a direct response to some of the bans or attempted bans on disability selective abortion. So here is a little piece from one of these studies, a recent analysis of the economic impact of abortion bans. So in this article, there was a theoretical cohort. Again, this is a simulated model of about 159,000 women in the states affected by a ban. And this article pointed out that this policy, so banning or prohibiting women from aborting their disabled child, results in an additional annual cost of $340 million, which corresponds to $2,124 per pregnant woman. So for all of the talk about the ways in which, if you watch any of the debates surrounding these bans, for all the ways that we talk about the ways that bans would restrict a woman's freedom and reproductive choice, for all of the parents who think they are making a purely private decision in these matters within a benevolent medical system that just really has their best interests at heart, here is a very crass economic analysis suggesting that we can't restrict these disability-selective abortions because, in fact, these children would cost us too much. And honestly, this is not just in the cost-effectiveness literature, but at every state legislative hearing I have been at, I've heard state legislators argue that we could never enforce these bans because they are too expensive, right? These children would cost us too much. I had one representative say to me, look, I can't go back to my constituents and tell them that we're going to have to pay for the children that would result, right, from restricting abortion in this case. So how to respond to these arguments? First of all, I think that the cost-effectiveness literature should horrify us. As a parent of a child with Down syndrome, these studies, honestly, are probably the hardest things I've ever read. To know that there are physicians calculating society's gain, right, at the deaths of children like my son, to know that these children are considered such throwaway creatures that their loss is not even recorded in the same ledger, right, in these studies as those who are typically developing, is absolutely gut-wrenching, right? I mean, I think these studies are horrific. So how can it be that for over 40 years, this line of research has continued virtually unchallenged in mainstream obstetric journals? Can no one stand up and say the math you are doing here is gravely immoral? It's not morally neutral. It's not only problematic if it goes on to inform policy decisions. The actual calculations themselves are gravely immoral. As I told you, there is a physician, Brian Scottco, who has done some very good work to undermine the assumptions in these models, in these calculations. For example, he's published some research suggesting that medical costs associated with raising a child with Down syndrome are much lower than previously thought. He's worked to show also some positive characteristics of individuals with Down syndrome. And he's shown in different ways that they are not simply a drain on society, right? That they can contribute, they hold jobs, they do productive things. You might have heard of some of the research, right? He's the one who published the research that over 90% of individuals with Down syndrome are happy with their lives, and over 90% of families of children with Down syndrome are happy to have these individuals in their lives. And this is all very good, right? And it's a very practical way to combat the assumptions in this research. However, there's part of me that is not entirely comfortable with this approach. A few years ago, I was at a legislative hearing and somebody was questioning me about how much it costs to raise a child with a disability, especially a child with Down syndrome. And I gave a very Brian Scottco-like answer that these children don't actually cost as much as we think, and that there was more Medicaid wastage probably than money spent on these systems, or on these children, just from my own observations of the system. And so I gave what I thought was a fairly good database answer to this man, right? But on the way home that night, I realized that I hadn't handled this well at all. The truth is that I entered into the argument, right, just on the senator's own terms of engagement. I conceded that we could talk about cost effectiveness, but maybe we could just recalculate. Maybe the children aren't as expensive, so the final result, that final index will come out differently, and maybe we won't have incentive, right, to kill these children. If we just plug some new numbers into the formula. I realize that as advocates for those with disabilities, if we play at this game, we will never win. Because the truth is that children with disabilities are expensive. You know, certainly there are some exceptions. There are some kids who beat the system, some children with Down syndrome who don't have a lot of problems. But then there are children like my son who honestly is very expensive. He's had multiple surgeries. He's had heart surgery, eye surgery, respiratory surgery. He has a feeding tube. He was just recently diagnosed with autism when we're going to be placing him in an intensive behavior therapy program, which is covered by insurance. It's 40 hours a week. He may be in this program for 1 or 2 years, right? I don't generally say this because the stakes are so high. I don't want people to know the problems associated with having a child with Down syndrome, right? Because I don't want mothers to go off and abort their children based on what I say. And I love my son. And so and these things to me are not overly burdensome. This is just a fact. He is an expensive child. And so as I was driving home, I realized too late the answer I should have given. The answer that Jerome Lejeune, the one who discovered the chromosomal basis of Down syndrome and whose cause is currently up for canonization, gave when he was asked the same question. He answered with a very brutal honesty and an almost sort of defiant courage, right? He said that people say the price of genetic diseases is high. If these individuals could be eliminated early on, the savings would be enormous. And then he says, it cannot be denied that the price of these diseases is high in suffering for the individual and in burdens for society, not to mention what parents suffer. But we can assign a value to that price. It's precisely what a society must pay to remain fully human. And so I think that I know that my answer would be different if I were asked this question now. We have to be willing to acknowledge that there is a cost, and sometimes a very high cost associated with those with these children with disabilities. But we don't necessarily have to be afraid of it, right? We just have to shoulder it. That's what it means to be human. And we do this not just for the sake of these children, but for our own sake as well, so that we can remain human. So thank you.